Morning. Going into the election, lots of polls made it seem like Joe Biden had this race all locked up.
Some showed he was 8 to 10 points ahead of President Trump. But in many states, the numbers did not pan out. So many political analysts and a lot of us regular voters are asking, what went wrong with the polls here?
Right.
The Minnesota polls were pretty good, Heather.
The Minnesota polls were actually quite good. And I just want to be clear pointing this out because I got a couple messages from people. We're talking about polls when we say the pre-election surveys, the polls that we talk about, not polling locations, the churches and the schools. Things didn't go wrong there.
Right.
It's the polls we're talking about.
Yeah, the events where we're like margin of error, plus or minus 3.5%, that sort of a deal.
Right. So you're right. Some of the polls were
good.
Were working and they were fine. And you also have to remember how we report the polls, how people interpret the polls. If someone's 2 points ahead, but still within that margin of error, it doesn't mean that they're ahead per se. It doesn't mean that they're for sure going to win. So you also have to sort of take that interpretation of the polls as well there.
If you're President Trump in his campaign, and you had internal polling too, right? So we can't just say, oh, it's all the media and their polls and all of that. But the reality is he slowed down campaigning in Washington, or Wisconsin rather, spent less money there because it looked like he was going to get his butt kicked. The polls were way off.
Yeah, and there's always a fear that people might not turn out to vote because they're listening to the polls and they're...
we have record turnout on both sides for both these candidates. So people blaming the polls on that, I think, are a little off.
But you talk about Wisconsin. There were some polls out there that were 8, 9, 17 points. And these are like legit polls there that were pointing to Biden's lead as being on average, 9 or 10 points ahead. It ended up in Wisconsin less than 1 percentage point.
So you talked to the guy who used to run the Minnesota poll at the Star Tribune, who's been on his fair share, his end of being criticized for having a bad poll. What did he say as far as what he thought the mistakes were? Yeah,
so he had a couple of things to point out. He said, first of all, it's just hard in general to model turnout. And it's throw on a pandemic on top of that. It's hard to know how many people were going to vote by mail. It's hard to know what people were feeling about showing up on Election Day, about showing up in early voting. And so when it's hard to figure out who's going to turn out, when they're going to turn out, if they're going to turn out, that can have an impact on some of these final polling results.
I think last time around, the pollsters in 2016 said they were missing kind of the non-college educated white woman voter who made a difference. And it seems like they missed that person again this time, even though they adjusted their models for the fact that maybe some people don't want to answer the phone. Right.
So they did adjust their models for education because they were missing that sort of that education piece. But the theory is, and of course it is too early to tell.
They don't know,
it certainly is. They're going to be doing lots and lots of reviews. We'll know a lot more once the votes are certified, once they do these reviews. But one of the working theories is right now that for years we've had this message thrown at us about fake news, about lamestream media. So that may have crossed over into the polling where some of these Trump voters, Republican voters are saying, look, I don't trust the system. I'm not going to trust the polling. So I'm actually not even going to respond at all. It's not so much that they're shy in saying who they vote for. The theory is that they're not even responding at all. And that you really have to figure out how to reach those people if you're going to have these scientific polls.
Yeah. Otherwise, what's the point?
Right. And so they have some work. These pollsters have some work cut out for them.
It's hard. I mean, having no poll, I don't know, then you're just stuck with whatever
you're just stuck with whatever your friends and family talk about,
so I don't know what the answer is.